What is Eli an example of? He's an example of 4 danger signs of bad parenting. We could summarize these danger signs of a bad dad as, number 1, a preoccupation with an occupation to the exclusion of the family. He was so preoccupied with his occupation that he never had time for his family. I remember Howie Hendricks used to always tell us in seminary, the most important moment of the day is when you're heading in your driveway, and he says you must set everything, even in the ministry, even in your occupation, whatever it might be, you must set everything aside because those next moments are the most important part of the day. And what he says is, he said, if you can't even take care of your family, how can you be in the ministry? But even wider than that, God says if you're preoccupied with your occupation and fail in your family, you are disobeying me, and you will answer for your disobedience like Eli did. Secondly, a refusal to face the severity of his children's actions. What we see is Eli started rationalizing or something, I don't know, but he didn't see the severity that their sins were not just sins of greed and self-indulgence and sins of fornication, which they were committing fornication with the women on their way in to worship God. It wasn't just that was severe, all that they were doing on a horizontal level. He did not see the vertical level, the severity of their sins in the sight of God. And see, that's what we were talking about with Job. Job prayed for his family, looking at them as God saw them, and said, I'm going to call sin, sin. Eli didn't. Thirdly, a failure to respond quickly and thoroughly to the warnings of others. If you read this text clearly, this unnamed prophet comes, and decades go by, and Eli still doesn't do anything about it. He does not respond quickly and thoroughly when warned by godly people. See, the Lord doesn't just leave us on our own. He gives His Word, He gives His Spirit, He gives godly people around us, and people that say, you know what? I'd be careful. It just looks like you're allowing and we should heed that counsel. And finally, rationalizing the wrong, thereby he became part of the problem. If 1 Corinthians 10:11 says these are our examples, what example can we get from Eli? Well, I call it this: we need to plan to not neglect our parenting. That's the final point. How do we plan to not neglect our parenting? Number 1, ask God to give you the joyful opportunity of introducing your kids to Jesus Christ. When Bonnie and I were dating, back when I was just finishing seminary, and we were talking about if we got married, our life together, she told me one thing. She says, honey, if the Lord ever gave us children, she said, my greatest heart's desire would be to so teach them the Word of God, so pray for them, and so share the gospel with them, that I would get to be the one that leads each of them to Christ. Did you know before we were even married, she was talking about her complete desire of raising up a godly generation and seeing our children follow the Lord so we could see our children's children someday follow the Lord. And you know what the blessing is? The Lord has allowed her to lead every one of our children to the Lord. The Lord knows our deepest desires and wants to respond to them. Number 1, ask God to give you the joyful opportunity of introducing your children to Jesus. Number 2, ask God for help in understanding how to shepherd the hearts of your children. The Lord designed them. The Lord knows how they're wired. Ask Him. He's already, by the way, given us about 99% of everything we need for good, effective parenting here. The 1% that He hasn't given us is He hasn't forced us. He gives us a choice to do what He said. And He asks us to do that. And finally, number 3, ask God to make you take time to apply what someone calls TLC to your children. You know what that is? The T of TLC is talk gently to them. Colossians 4:6 says, let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, and that counts with children. Talk gently to them. The L of TLC is listen lovingly to them. Did you know often we don't listen lovingly, we listen and pounce. As soon as they say one false thing, boom, we're in there. And boy, do they want to talk anymore after that? Are you kidding? Listen lovingly to them. In fact, Paul put it this way, 1 Thessalonians 2:11, he says, I was like a father with his children, gently nurturing you. Finally, practice the C of TLC. That's correcting consistently their errors and problems. Ephesians 6 tells us, fathers are not to exasperate, but to balance nurture, which is encouragement, and admonition, which is correction. And there has to be a balancing of those. This requires time, and it may even require a few nights of putting the TV to bed early and spending the time with your children instead. How many parents put the kids to bed early so they can spend time when they've never really spent time with the kids to start with? And maybe it means investing time with your children instead of work from the office or your ministry or your hobby or whatever is not as important as an eternal soul. We need to resist the do-nothing syndrome of Eli and instead dive prayerfully into parenting our children, because we will answer to the Lord, not for how they turn out, but for how we raised them.